Hi, and a while ago I talked about the melee versus range DPS balance in that there are quite a few more melee DPS classes than range DPS classes. As a consequence, you get many more melee DPS players than range DPS players. So in terms of a raid roster, there's much more pressure on melee DPS players for spots than there is on range DPS. The other problem is that most raid encounters, if they favour one or the other, they mostly favour range DPS. In other words, sure, have a few melee DPS, but even sometimes on fights where your balance is okay, you sort of secretly want more range DPS. Now, what I want to look at is, in Legion, how have the fights been going so far? Do we have extra problems because of the extra pressure? Because remember, we have an extra melee DPS to fit into our rosters, and no new range DPSs. In fact, we've never had a new range DPS. So let's start with Nathendra. Now, the main issues for melee on Nathendra are that when someone in melee gets rot, they're going to do an AoE around them. So if you're not all spread out, that means other people are going to get the debuff. On Heroic and Normal, this is more likely to happen with a balanced raid group because you'll have so many more melee DPS. On Mythic, you've got much less. You can certainly get away with an average, but the debuff is extra harsh because you're going to get mind controlled. If you have too many mind control, then you get into all sorts of trouble. But it is okay with a balance because you've got enough for a few either side of the boss. It isn't a big issue. Another problem with melee, of course, is when they get rot, you have to move out. Now, neither range nor melee are going to be able to do very much, if any, DPS while they're running out with rot. Potentially, range could do some DPS while they're waiting for the rot debuff to tick down before they have to move back. Melee, of course, are not going to be able to do anything. Is that a major thing? It shouldn't be a massive issue. We were talking literally a few seconds. But of course, melee DPS are in the majority, so ideally what you'd want to reflect the fact that there are many more melee DPS than range players is actually ask yourself, what would this fight be if you had, say, 3/4 of your DPS being melee? Would this work? The answer is no. So in this particular situation, you're absolutely fine with a balance of ranged and melee DPS. You would not really want to take an excess of melee DPS, however. So, on to the next fight, Elaretha Renferal. Now, issues with melee here, they're not actually too bad. If you get the debuff, which means you're going to start dropping poison puddles on the ground, then of course you are going to have to move out at some point for several seconds, and that means you're not going to be able to do DPS. If you get the tornadoes, you're going to have to move away. Of course, ranged would also have to move away, and that's going to put a crimp on their DPS as well. So, melee and range with tornadoes, neither one is better placed than the other, really. There isn't a situation where choosing a spot where you want is necessarily any better. I would say on this fight, range don't have a massive advantage over melee, other than potentially getting the debuffs that cause you to have to move out. So I'm going to actually suggest on this one, it doesn't really matter. Have a balance of melee or ranged, even have a little bit more melee than ranged, will generally work pretty well. Ursoc. Ursoc, you generally, especially on Mythic, tend to crowd around the boss anyway. You're sort of in melee range of the boss, whether you're ranged or melee. So I'm going to suggest on this one, there is absolutely no difference. You could basically take all melee. You've no need even for the abilities that only ranged DPS classes provide, like demonic gateways and so on. So for Ursoc, actually, do you know what? Makes no difference whether you're melee or ranged. On to the next fight, Dragon's a Nightmare. Not ideal for melee on this one. The main problem when you're on the dragons with melee is your plants spawn, which sometimes spawn the odd ad, which if it hits you will debuff you, causing you to do 50% less damage. This is very likely to be hitting melee, whereas ranged are further out and can kill them before they actually target onto anyone. However, melee are very effective for the portal group on Mythic mode. So you want some melee. Would you actually want half of your DPS to be melee? Not ideally. Can you manage with half of your DPS as melee? Yes. You can take a balance and that's no problem. Would you want to though? No. So, and you certainly wouldn't want to take more than that. So for this fight, melee, extra pressure on, definitely, much like a lot of fights traditionally. Next, on to Il'gynoth. Main problem with melee on this one is it is a big target switching fight where you're moving around. One of the targets you'll have to switch to are the blobs, and these of course do an explosion when you kill them. And they will put a dot on everyone as well on Mythic mode when this happens as well. Ranged are able to attack these, first of all, without getting the AoE damage after it. Of course, melee can run out from it, but then while you're running out, you're not doing DPS even on the next target. It also means they can be stood in the healer's AoE healing effects when the dot is ticking, so you can switch targets nice and comfortably. You often get tentacles spawning. Now, these things can be quite close to the eye, in which case not too bad. They can be way away, which means ranged even will not have range on them, but they don't have to move anywhere near as far before they can start attacking them and can quickly then move back to the middle as necessary. The one big advantage for melee on this one is that they can, first of all, interrupt more often on the mind flaying stalks, and second of all, when you're having to move around, whether it's with the debuffs on you and the heart phase, or whether just moving around from the crap on the mythic version, melee are able to do that much more easily than ranged. So on balance, you get away with a balance of melee and ranged, but if anything, you would actually want more ranged DPS, and you certainly wouldn't want the majority of your DPS to be melee DPS at all. Next boss is Scenarious. Scenarious has, again, target switching issues where those targets are far away. And not only do you necessarily have to switch between the boss and ads, which are at the other side of the room, you may also have to switch from the ads or the boss, whatever you're DPSing, to a patch of ground to cleanse your debuff. Now, ranged, of course, can position themselves near these puddles and switch targets fairly freely. Downside to range on this one, because we've got to be fair, they have to put up with a mechanic that melee don't have to put up with, in that they may get targeted with brambles. It's not easy to know if you've been targeted with brambles. The only way to do that is to make sure that you're spread out. And if you see it coming towards you, as long as you're the only person in that direction, then you sort of know it's you and you know you need to move. So they do get an extra job there. So in terms of difficulty of the fight, I would definitely say it's more difficult for range because they've got that extra mechanic to be mindful of. However, it's more frustrating to maximize DPS for melee because they're having to move backwards and forwards. What would you want out of your DPS roster? You would ideally like an excess of ranged DPS, it has to be said. You can get away with a balance of melee DPS and ranged DPS, and I mean that really. You know, a lot of guilds will certainly take a roughly equal number of each, but if you were honest and you had the choice, you would probably want to take more ranged, and you certainly wouldn't want to take extra melee. Finally, on to Xavius. For most of Xavius, you would think it doesn't matter a great deal whether you have lots of melee or lots of ranged or vice versa. You could sort of argue the ads you have to deal with, which drop puddles, easier for range because, of course, they can target switch to those while still stood near the boss and switch one for the other without having to move between them, which melee have to do. However, the puddles do need soaking, so you have to sort of move to them anyway to soak them. So from that point of view, I would say there is no major advantage of being ranged DPS over melee DPS. You wouldn't necessarily want lots of melee DPS simply, though, because of the ads on Mythic that can spawn up and do an AoE effect if they are in contact with anyone, which, of course, would deal out a lot of corruption if everyone was jammed into melee range of the boss. But I would say on this fight, you can definitely take a balance of melee or ranged DPS. You might even get away with having slightly more melee DPS than ranged DPS, although I would argue you probably wouldn't want that. So moving on to the second raid, Trial of Valor. Odin. Odin is definitely not that nice for melee. You can absolutely have a nice balance of melee and ranged DPS. Even on Mythic Odin, yes you can. However, there are certain difficulties that mean you probably don't want that if you can help it. Of course, most guilds can't because there are so many melee players. 1, Horn of Valor. You need to be spread out. Okay. Secondly, there's a lot of target switching and it can be quite regular as well. You want a spot whereby you can be DPSing your priority target and you can sort of make sure you're moving away from the orbs that spawn from the spears. Now, of course, range will struggle to do DPS while they're moving around these orbs. Melee, of course, while they're avoiding these orbs while they move around a target, can maximize their DPS whilst doing that. So they get a little bit of an advantage there. But in terms of choosing their spot where the orbs are not even really going to appear, it's much more difficult when having to avoid Horn of Valor as well as the orbs. while still DPSing, that can be very, very difficult as well. And as I say, having to move across the room to DPS from one target to another, very, very difficult as well. You would ideally not have a balance of melee and range for most of the fight, except, of course, in phase 3, well, you can argue it swings the other way because you've only got one target and that target's moving around a lot. For which melee, of course, will still be able to DPS on the move when you're moving from one section to another. Downside is, in Mythic, when you get your runes and you have to move away from the boss, you're stuck doing no DPS until the rune sort of lands as such. So, swings and roundabouts on that one. But I would say on the fight in general, the absolute limit would be half of your DPS as melee, ideally. Otherwise, you're going to run into more troubles than you would like. And in actual fact, you'd probably prefer slightly more range DPS than melee DPS. On to Guam. Guam has a number of issues. It probably does favour an absolute balance of melee and range DPS because you don't want too many melee DPS, but at the same time, if you have too many range, they've got to spread out to avoid having licks on everyone, and there's limited room to do that. Range DPS are able to carry on DPS in the boss when it does its charge round, melee or not, but the charge round doesn't last that long in the fight. So what I would say on this one is a balance of melee and range DPS is absolutely fine, but you don't want an excess of melee. Finally, Helya. This is another fight with lots of target switching, especially in phase 2. That being said, if the targets are managed and tanked properly, it's not necessarily massive movements between them, so it shouldn't be a huge problem for melee DPS. And of course, when you have to move into or away from effects, then that's much less of a problem for melee, as long as they can remain in melee range of their target, because of course you can DPS on the move, as long as you're not having to switch from one target on one side of the room to another on the other. At the same time, range do get to stand so that they can see more of the fight and they can see what's going on a little bit better, and it's a bit easier for them to move out the way with certain effects. Melee at the front, of course, are likely to cause lots of ground effects, which will limit their room massively, especially towards the end of the fight. And of course, when you get targeted by an orb, you're moving a hell of a long way to the back to get it out of the way. So there's probably greater amounts of time that you're taking DPS off than perhaps for ranged as well there. What I would say on this fight is you can get away with a balance of melee and ranged DPS, because I don't think the advantages of lots of ranged DPS necessarily outweigh the benefits that melee bring. But at the same time, I would say that melee don't bring any particular benefits as such. It's not like there's interrupting to be done, really. You just want to DPS things down as quickly as possible, soak the tentacle slams, and kill any adds that appear very, very quickly in a priority order. So those are the fights so far. Those are the 10 fights so far, in fact. On balance, what I would say is you generally get away with a nice balance of melee and range DPS. Of course, traditionally, this has been the issue. Does it necessarily mean that I think Legion is making a good start so far? There are a couple of caveats to this. The first is, I have talked in a lot of these fights about there being, you're getting away with a nice balance of melee and range DPS. The issue is, of course, more than half of all DPS players at any level of the game are melee. So in actual fact, what we really would want is fights that don't really favour melee or ranged at all. You sort of want, you wouldn't necessarily want to take all melee, and you wouldn't necessarily want to take all ranged. But let's say you had 3/4 of one and 1/4 of the other, or 2/3 of one and 1/3 of another at least, then that should be accommodated, and it sort of isn't. So I do think Blizzard, if they see it as a problem, and I really don't think they do see it as a problem, could probably do with some extra work on that. The other issue is this. You can have 9 fights out of 10 where there is no issue, you know, bring even amounts of melee DPS, range DPS, bring a bit more melee DPS, bring a bit more range DPS, doesn't matter. But there's that one fight where you really don't want to bring a lot of melee DPS, and when you're planning your roster with the future tier in mind, you've got that in the back of your head and you say to yourself, well, there's no fight where we want loads and loads of melee, but there is this one fight where we really don't want many of them at all. And that will, of course, inform your future roster planning, and it will mean that you will favour more ranged DPS players. So you perpetuate this issue of very, very tough for melee DPS players to get guild spots, and not nearly as tough for ranged DPS players. So you can end up with ranged DPS players in better guilds than necessarily they should be getting, and some melee DPS players struggling to get in guilds that are roughly at their level. But That's just my opinion, of course. You may have different opinions, you may have different views. I certainly don't think that the fights have been bad. I haven't felt, oh, this is a melee unfriendly boss, I have to say, on any of the fights so far, even though I have sort of also thought to myself, you wouldn't want much more melee than we've already got on this one. But of course, what do you think? Do you think the fights have been good for melee, been bad for melee? Have you personally found they've been tricky? Have you been a melee player and you sort of wish, oh, do you know what? I wish I was a ranged player. Have you been a ranged player? Am I missing out some of the downsides? There are downsides. I'm perfectly aware of that. Often, one of the things that Blizzard do to try and encourage a few more melee DPS in there is they give ranged DPS mechanics to deal with that the melee don't have to deal with, such as on Scenarious with the Brambles and such as on Guam with the Lick, for example. You know, and of course, this can be a very stressful event. And even though on balance, you might sort of say, well, we still want more ranged, it is an extra hassle for those ranged DPS players. Absolutely. But anyway, I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Until next time, I'll see you later.